London, November 7th, 1955. A man steps in front of the cameras. Reporters pack the room. The question hanging in the air is the same one everyone in British intelligence has been asking for 2 years. Is Harold Adrian Russell Philby a Soviet spy? He adjusts his collar. He does not sweat. He does not hesitate. I have not, and I have never been a communist. He walks out of that room a free man. The press call it a victory. His colleagues at MI6 raise a glass to him that evening. His oldest friend, Nicholas Elliott, never doubts him for a second. What nobody in that room knew, and what we now know with absolute certainty, is that by the time Philby made that statement, he had already been working for Soviet intelligence for 21 years. And in that time, the names he passed to Moscow had already sent men to their deaths. This is the story of how Kim Philby came within one appointment of running MI6, while already running it for the KGB. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the world Philby was born into, and the one he chose to betray it for. Harold Adrian Russell Philby, Kim to everyone who knew him, arrived at Cambridge in 1929 with every advantage a young Englishman could possess. His father was a celebrated Arabist and explorer. The family name carried weight. The doors of the British establishment opened for him automatically. But something happened to Philby at Cambridge that most accounts glide past. In February 1934, the Austrian Chancellor ordered artillery fire on working-class apartment buildings in Vienna, killing hundreds of civilians in what history would call the February Uprising. Philby read the dispatches as they came in. He later described it to a colleague as the moment the argument settled itself. The democratic West had watched a government shell its own citizens and done nothing. That same spring, a soft-spoken Hungarian academic named Arnold Deutsch approached him. Not in a back alley, at a garden party, in a conversation that stretched across 2 hours. Deutsch's instructions were specific, and Philby never forgot them. Publicly distance yourself from socialism. Join the right clubs. Say the right things. Make them trust you first. To prove his commitment, Philby joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, a pro-Nazi organization, as cover. He shook hands with men whose politics disgusted him and smiled. It was the first performance. He was very, very good at it. What makes Philby different from every other spy in Cold War history is what happened next. He did not go underground. He did not disappear into the shadows. He walked directly into the heart of the British establishment and climbed. By 1944, he was head of the Soviet section of MI6. The man responsible for tracking Soviet intelligence operations was a Soviet intelligence operation. But there is something even darker underneath the career, because Philby's rise was not just measured in promotions. It was measured in the people whose names he handed to Moscow, and who were never seen again. The question everyone eventually asks about Philby is, why? He had everything: money, status, the most prestigious career in British intelligence. Why spend 30 years risking everything for a foreign power? The easy answer is ideology. The honest answer is that ideology was only one layer. On the surface, layer 1, Philby told himself he was fighting fascism. In the 1930s, that was not an absurd position. The Soviet Union seemed, from Cambridge, to be the only force serious about confronting Hitler. But layer 2 was something more personal. His father, St. John Philby, was a man who had publicly rejected England to serve the Saudi royal family. A man who built his identity around being the great outsider, the man who saw through the pretense of the British Empire. Kim watched his father's defiance his entire childhood. The contempt for establishment loyalty was not an ideology he acquired at Cambridge. It was something he inherited. Layer 3 was structural. By the time Philby was fully embedded inside MI6, the machinery was already in motion. Stopping would have meant exposure. Exposure would have meant prison, or worse. The ideology that started the engine was no longer what was keeping it running. And then there is Layer 4, the one his biographers return to with the most unease. The men who worked alongside Philby described someone who came alive in deception. Not someone managing the stress of a double life, someone who required it. He had a pronounced stammer in ordinary conversation. It was documented, noticeable, sometimes debilitating. When he lied, it disappeared completely. All of this might have remained buried forever. Except that in August 1945, a Soviet diplomat walked into the British consulate in Istanbul and tried to sell MI6 the one thing that would have destroyed Kim Philby completely. His name was Konstantin Volkov. Volkov was an NKVD officer operating under consular cover, and he was desperate. He contacted the British consulate with an extraordinary offer. In exchange for safe passage to the West and a large sum of money, he would hand over the identities of Soviet agents currently embedded inside British intelligence. 3 moles, active, inside MI6 right now. One of them, Volkov specified, held a senior position in British counterintelligence. The request was forwarded to London. London assigned the case to its head of anti-Soviet operations, Kim Philby. Philby read Volkov's offer. He understood immediately what it meant. He cabled Moscow. Then he delayed the British response for 3 weeks, citing administrative difficulties, slow communications, minor bureaucratic obstacles. By the time a British officer arrived in Istanbul to meet Volkov, Volkov was gone. 2 witnesses at the airport later reported seeing 2 Soviet consular staff carrying a stretcher onto a Moscow-bound aircraft. The figure on the stretcher appeared to be sedated. Bandages covered most of the face. Konstantin Volkov and his wife were never seen in the West again. Volkov was not the only one. In the late 1940s, the CIA and MI6 launched Operation Valuable, one of the most ambitious covert operations of the early Cold War. The plan: infiltrate trained Albanian agents across the border to destabilize Enver Hoxha's communist government from within. If it worked, it would be the first rollback of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Philby was the MI6 liaison in Washington, overseeing the operation. He knew everything: the names of the agents, their training sites, their drop zones, their contacts inside Albania. He passed all of it to Moscow. The first teams landed and were met immediately by Albanian security forces, as if they had been expected. Because they had been. Team after team was captured on arrival. The agents who were not killed immediately were paraded through show trials, then executed. Volkov. The Albanian agents. These were not statistics. They were the names behind every year Philby had spent undetected, the men who died so he could keep walking free. In Washington, Philby's American counterpart watched the operation collapse in real time and could not understand what had gone wrong. His name was James Angleton. He trusted Philby completely. They drank together at Harvey's restaurant in Washington every week. Angleton would later say that Philby's betrayal broke something in him permanently, that he spent the rest of his career unable to trust anyone. And then, even after Albania, even after Volkov, even after two of his fellow Cambridge Five were forced to flee to Moscow in 1951, and suspicion finally fell on Philby directly. Even then, MI6 could not bring themselves to believe it. They cleared him, gave him a public statement, and began quietly discussing whether to bring him back in from the cold and give him the position he had always been destined for, Chief of MI6. By 1963, Philby was working as a journalist in Beirut, a cover story, and everyone in the intelligence community understood it as such. MI6 was still watching him, still not acting. Then Nicholas Elliott flew to Beirut. Elliott and Philby had been friends since the 1940s. Elliott had defended Philby's name inside MI6 for over a decade. He had staked his own reputation, his own career, on Philby's innocence. New evidence had arrived. Definitive. Undeniable. Elliott sat across from Philby in a Beirut apartment and gave him the terms. A partial confession in exchange for immunity. Philby could stay in England. His family would be protected. The whole thing could be managed quietly. Philby confessed. Not everything, but enough. He confirmed he had been a Soviet agent. He confirmed the Volkov case. He did not mention Albania. Elliott left Beirut to consult London on next steps. On the night of January 23, 1963, Kim Philby boarded a Soviet cargo ship in Beirut harbor. He was never coming back. Moscow gave him a general's rank, a Lenin order, a large apartment in a prestigious district. And immediately, before the ink on his welcome papers was dry, the KGB opened a surveillance file on him. As early as 1948, NKVD records show that Moscow had never been able to fully close the question. Was Philby genuine, or was he a man so perfectly placed inside British intelligence that he might be feeding them exactly what London wanted them to believe? They had run the calculation and decided to trust him, but they never stopped running it. In Moscow, they welcomed him with one hand and watched him with the other. He spent the next 25 years in a flat that grew shabbier every year. He drank heavily. His marriages failed. And the Soviet Union he had imagined from Cambridge, the system worth 30 years of betrayal, turned out to be nothing he recognized. He outlived it by 3 years. Kim Philby died in Moscow on May 11, 1988. He was 76 years old. Consider for a moment, what does not happen if Philby is never caught? If the 1963 evidence had not forced Elliott's hand, if Philby had continued his quiet rehabilitation inside British intelligence and received the appointment that was already being discussed, he would have become chief of MI6 sometime in the mid-1960s. The head of British foreign intelligence, the man with access to every asset, every operation, every Allied secret shared under the Five Eyes framework. The CIA's entire Cold War intelligence architecture would have passed through him. Every NATO contingency plan, every Soviet dissident MI6 had ever run, every source inside the Warsaw Pact. That number, 17,000, is what 30 years as an agent produced. As chief, in a single decade, he could have surpassed it entirely. The Cold War's balance of power might look unrecognizable. But here is the question that no one has a clean answer to, and the one I want you to sit with. MI6 knew by 1951 that Philby was the most likely suspect. They cleared him anyway. They let him work in Beirut. They flew Elliot out with an immunity offer rather than arresting him outright. And when he boarded that ship in January 1963, the British government let nearly a year pass before they told Washington. Was that incompetence? Or was it a decision? A Philby trial in a London court would have required MI6 to explain in public how its head of anti-Soviet operations had been a Soviet agent for 3 decades. How Volkov died. What happened in Albania. How many men James Angleton had burned on Philby's intelligence. A defection is embarrassing. A trial is catastrophic. Nicholas Elliot spent the rest of his career refusing to discuss Beirut. He destroyed the notes from that final meeting. He died in 1994, having never given a full account of what was said in that apartment, or what he was actually authorized to offer. He was the last person Philby trusted. The files that would answer the remaining questions are still classified. Some are scheduled for release. Others have no release date at all. Which raises the question I'll leave with you. In a story built entirely on loyalty and betrayal, where exactly do you draw the line between them? If this file unsettled you, the next one will go further. The man who recruited Philby's recruits and ran the most successful penetration operation in Western intelligence history is already waiting.